for Abernathy to, like, take over after King's death, but how do you think he at least tried to be a leader in that situation?
The biggest difficulty that Abernathy has there is that King's whole idea of the Poor People's Campaign is a very difficult, very risky, long shot effort. And so, even if King had lived, the Poor People's Campaign probably would not have been viewed as a success. And so when it ends, fairly badly in that summer of 1968, Abernathy is blamed, in some part unfairly, for that. The other very obvious problem is that Jesse Jackson is enough of a sort of egomaniac and self-promoter even in 1968 that Jackson, is always believing and suggesting that he could do it much better than Abernathy could.
Okay, so, like, what do you think would have happened, or would anything have happened differently if Jackson had taken over instead of Abernathy?
Jackson was unpopular enough among the other people around King that was not going to happen. Some of the people closest to King wanted Andrew Young to step forward and, be more assertive, and, there's at least the thought there that Young would be better than Abernathy, but there was no way that Andy Young himself would do that, because to do that would be a knowing violation of what Dr. King had wanted.
Okay.
And Andy, so Andy is in a position of, being loyal to King's embrace of Abernathy.
Okay, and then I know that you said that, like, Abernathy, I don't know, he wasn't as much, like, fit for leading a movement like that as King was, but like, did anything good come out of that or not?
Ralph could be entirely successful within black Southern communities, but in the northern, white elite communities where King was very popular, Ralph in places like that with people like that, Ralph didn't seem, even imaginably close to being King's equal. The other sort of final piece of things I should say is that, once the Voting Rights Act of 1965, becomes law, by, 1970, 1972, 1974, so much black political energy that back in the 60s, was channeled only into civil rights groups and civil rights protests, all of a sudden, as of the early 70s, with the Southern political system now much more open to black political activism, an awful lot of effort starts going into people running for office, like Andy Young running for Congress in 1972. And so no matter who was heading it by, 1972 or so, SCLC inescapably is going to be less important than it was 6 or 7 years earlier.
Okay, and then talking about the SCLC again, it's to my understanding that Abernathy was president after King's assassination. Is
Right,
that true?
exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
So how is he a leader in that aspect?
It's a titular role, but it's not simply the crux of it is not being president of an organization. It's having to be Martin Luther King's successor and replacement, and that's the impossible part.
Mhm. Okay, so do you think he did a good job of stepping up to for King, not just in general, but for the SCLC?
I mean, I would say Abernathy does an adequate job. But he's being asked, or people are expecting him to be something that he can't.
Okay.
He can be president of SCLC, but he can't be the reincarnation of Martin Luther King.
Okay. And then, so going back to the civil rights movement, what do you think the legacy of that is, the whole movement?
I think the number one legacy is the legislative achievements like the 1964 Act and the 1965 Act. More broadly, we now, 50 years later, have a, much larger black middle class, black representation in, professions and major national organizations. But we also still have, huge proportions of black America that in terms of education and employment and housing, remain, in a poverty situation.
Okay, and then also, so then separately from the civil rights movement, what do you think Ralph Abernathy's legacy was?
King's most loyal companion.
Okay, and then how do you think those two legacies, the legacy of the civil rights movement and Ralph Abernathy's legacy, tie together?
Abernathy's legacy is tied to King. I mean, Abernathy's legacy up through 1968 is as the closest companion. After 1968, his legacy is as the successor who could not possibly be King's equal.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so this doesn't necessarily have to do with, the civil rights movement or him being, a preacher, but, how did he affect people on a personal level and inspire them?
Very warm. I mean, Ralph was a very warm, avuncular, if that's a word you are familiar with. And Ralph, like King, had a great sense of humor and would speak, was an excellent speaker at using humor. There's a wonderful tape, I don't think it's available on the web, where Ralph is preaching at Brown Chapel in Selma, which was back in the coverage so much a week ago. And the county sheriff and the city police chief, they had a visible microphone to record the mass meetings there. And so Ralph preaches to the microphone. He calls it the doohickey. And it's a wonderful speech, talking to the law enforcement microphone and making fun of it. If you Google Ralph Abernathy and doohickey, and I'd spell it like Doohickey. I wonder how many references might turn up to that speech, because I think amongst most movement people, that is Ralph's best known public remarks.
Okay. So kind of like going back, sorry, this is like one of the last questions.
Sure.
Going back to the Poor People's Campaign, can you just kind of talk about the goals of it, what it was about, and then how King and Abernathy led it?
King's goals for the campaign were, very far-reaching, and wanting to force the federal government to really confront economic inequality, and not just racial discrimination. But the whole strategy of the campaign was just to have thousands of people show up in Washington, D.C., and, stay there, camp there, until the Congress did something. And so it wasn't very, it wasn't planned in any great detail. And then once, under Abernathy, once folks get to D.C., Congress is not really responsive, and it just becomes a waiting game of how long is it going to be before folks leave.
Okay, and then, going back to the SCLC, can you just kind of explain, like, what the aims of the organization were and, like, what it was established for?
Sure. SCLC is envisioned as a South-wide organization that would link together mainly through black churches the local movements that were beginning to appear in cities like Montgomery and Birmingham and Tallahassee, Florida, and Mobile and New Orleans. And, unlike something like the NAACP, SCLC was going to be an organization of congregations and other groups, not just an individual membership group.
Okay, and then, so after talking about Abernathy really being there for King, do you think the movement would have had a different ending or a different effect if Abernathy hadn't been there for King?
No, I don't think it would have. I think it would have been much harder, much emotionally harder for King to do what people were asking him to do had Abernathy not been there with him.
Okay, and then, so that's all my questions. So is there anything else that you'd like to add or say?
No, I think the one other thing I'd say is just to underscore how both Ralph and Dr. King were first and foremost products of the black church, and that they're both throughout all of this, they're both pastoring churches as well as being civil rights leaders.
All right. Okay. So thank you so much for letting me interview you. It's been like